it's a great pleasure to welcome Noel to his annual visit to Hamilton Towers. Cheers.
Cheers.
And he's brought with him a copy of my book, The Long and Winding Road, which we may well talk about, I think, today. But Noel, it's great to see you. A little bit later, you're going to get your bathers on, have a swim.
I am. Yes, I'm going to do an Auntie Gertie and get my knickers wet.
Oh, yes. Well, you're talking about my Auntie Gertie. She is the lady who introduced me to speedway racing. She took me and my cousin Ian to Wembley Stadium when I was a boy, and huge crowds, 80,000 watching league speedway matches at Wembley Stadium. And she used to tell me that when the racing was really exciting, she used to wet herself. So I'd bring her up on the school holidays and say, Auntie, how did the Lions win on Thursday night? Yes, they did. Did Tommy Price get a maximum? Yes, he did. Did you wet yourself? Several times. So I knew it was a good meeting.
I knew it was a good one. Yeah. I mean, that is one of the extraordinary things about the book, that you have this detail in minutiae of the characters, the names, who they are. The retention is absolutely amazing, David.
Yes, I thought I would write the book while the retention was still there. I had two thoughts. One was that I'll tell it while I still remember it, and the other one was I better do it before I pop my clogs. So I'm still here, and luckily I can still remember.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you know, obviously the ambition as well. You went to Tyne Tees. Strangely enough, although you had that great start in Cologne in broadcasting,
yes,
and you interviewed Cliff very early on. That's an amazing interview. Still makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck when I listen to that.
Yeah.
But then for a few years, you really became more of a TV personality than a radio personality, and you had to work so hard to achieve that. And you were so focused because I think there was an alternative TV Times, wasn't there, up in the north?
It was called The Viewer.
Yeah, and they had a TV Personality of the Year, and you looked at that, a total rookie in television, and you said, I'm going to go for that. Next year, that's mine. And
yes, well, on the first night that I was there, I was the continuity announcer, and I watched it from my studio, and I said to myself, I'm going to win that next year. And how was I going to win it when there were comedians, singers, other presenters and everything? So I decided the whole thing about announcers at that time, they were a little bit stiff and starchy. And so I decided to lighten it all up. So when I introduced Emergency Ward 10, I would come on in a white coat and a stethoscope, and I would say to the viewer, you're not looking too good. I think you need half an hour in Emergency Ward 10. Or if it was a Western, I put a Stetson on and say, howdy folks, let's mosey on to the OK Corral. Anyway, cutting a long story short, a year later I won the award. Vera Lynn came up to Newcastle and presented me with the award as Male Personality of the Year, Tyne Tees Television.
Yeah, that really was showing incredible focus, and
yes.
And also at the time you were having to do so many different things. I mean, in the announcer's box, doing the announcing, as you say, you even invented your own little character long before
Gus Honeybun.
Yeah, Gus Honeybun.
Well, I think maybe about the same time, I had a little cat called Toby, which is a very strange name. Some people thought it was Toby, but it was Toby because he didn't know, or it didn't know, whether it wanted to be a boy or a girl. So it was kind of transgender before that.
I was going to say, even long before, I know Philip Schofield, I think it was, had some character in the broom cupboard when he was introducing children's television.
Yeah, he did.
You were doing that long before that.
Well, I was doing that in 1961 in Newcastle. Yeah. The thing is, there was quite a lot of time to fill up during the afternoon.
Yeah.
So one of the scriptwriters did the voice of Toby. He was crouched under the desk, so you just see the puppet and me, and he was down there, and then he'd say, hello Uncle David.
I think a pioneer in terms of television. I mean, I think a lot of people will remember you probably be the first person they think of as an in-vision announcer, particularly as you did a spell with Southern Television.
Thames, of course,
with Thames Television,
a long time,
and I just happened to note that you nearly ended up working for Twat TV.
Well, when I was at Tyne Tees Television, between the Tyne and the Tees is another river, the Wear, and that's Sunderland, of course, and some people from Sunderland, very proud people, and they felt that should be mentioned as well, and it should be not Tyne Tees Television, but Tyne Weir and Tees Television. And that was going to happen until they realised that the initials were Twat Television.
Great, isn't it? Anyway, so moving on from there, then of course you moved. ABC closed down, and you did you actually wrote, produced, and introduced the very last
yes,
program.
Goodbye from ABC,
Yeah.
which had 12 years of highlights of one of the pioneering stations.
Yeah.
And we closed it on the Sunday, and I drove with the family to Surrey on the Monday, and then did the opening night of Thames Television on the Tuesday. And on the opening night of Thames, the electricians, the engineers went on strike and pulled the plugs on a Tommy Cooper show at 8 o'clock, peak time. I had to say on the first night, we apologise for the loss of your programme. In the meantime, we'll play some music. And all you had was a caption and music for an hour.
It wasn't the first time you did that, because I remember some years later, in the late 70s, there were an awful lot of strikes going on at the time. And I think it was at the BBC where in the end, it was just a few chosen people like yourself who could come in and actually keep the whole show on the road.
Yes, when I was at Radio 2 that happened.
Yeah.
There were a lot of strikes at that particular time.
Yeah.
The industry was rife with them. But I tell you, you're talking about versatility. When I was in Manchester working with ABC Television, there was a transmission controller I worked with called Dougie Fairbairn. He was a very good friend of mine. And normally on a Sunday morning before, because they were the weekend company, we would play tennis, and he was a joker, Dougie, and he rang me up one day and he said, David, a plane has come down in the middle of Stockport, get a black suit on and a black tie, get into Stockport and be ready to report on it. So I said, come on, Dougie, you want a game of tennis? He said, no, I'm serious, mate. So I drove into Stockport, and I could find where it was, the billowing smoke and the smell, and 72 people died on that plane. It was a plane coming back from Mallorca to Ringway Airport in Manchester, and it came down in the middle of Stockport, and it was very harrowing to have to report on it. But so many people turned up to watch what was going on. About 10,000 people there, that in the end they had burger vans and ice cream vans, for the public who were gawping at this terrible spectacle. So for me, 1 minute I'd been working with Ken Dodd and doing comedy sketches, and the next week I was reporting on an air disaster. So because there weren't as many people around in those days, you had to have that kind of versatility.
Absolutely, yeah. You needed a whole range of talents and instruments to
and it was good. It was a good grounding for me, because it taught me so many different techniques to do it.
Yeah.
Obviously, television and radio are completely different techniques. With television, a smile, a twinkle in the eyes can tell something that you can't get from radio, Whereas radio, it's the voice has got to tell you everything.
But then you did come back into radio, and principally, of course, at that time it was the Light programme, and you were doing, was it the Beat Show?
I did the Beat Show. That was my first broadcast, 1962, from Manchester.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of hybrid programme with BBC Northern Dance Orchestra, and then pop groups of the day, like, the Searchers, Wayne Fontana
Kinks.
and the Mindbenders. And the audience was mainly teenagers who loved the beat groups, but were a bit bored by the orchestra, it wasn't ideal, but it was how things were. The reason for that was because the Musicians Union was a very strong union, and they insisted a certain amount of music was live on the BBC.
Yeah, because there was conflict, I seem to remember later on as well, that you couldn't do something you wanted to do at Thames, I think, because you were Equity, and it was they said, no, you're not a journalist.
Yes, what it was I was doing the continuity announcing, and they decided they were going to follow the news at 10 with local news, which of course still happens now. And having read news before for Thames in America, I thought I was going to get the gig. And they said, well, unfortunately, you're an Equity member, and we're going to use NUJ members, National Union of Journalists, and so we can't use you. And that was when I finished. I gave up the job. I thought, well, the only meaty bit of the evening, somebody else is going to do it in my studio. I'm off.
It sounds like you had a great time in America.
I did.
And actually, I'm going to pick you up on something you said, because you said, "Oh, Eamon would never have me on This Is Your Life," but actually he did. You were in Fluff Freeman's This Is Your Life.
I was what?
In Alan Freeman's
was
This
I? I
Is Your
thought
Life.
that was Michael Aspel. Who
No,
was
it was
doing that.
introduced by Eamon.
Oh, so Eamon did.
Yeah, but he could hardly leave you out of the roster of DJs.
No.
That came in.
Well, Eamon was a very nice man and a forgiving soul, and a good Catholic.
Yeah. Absolutely. But so you got you were doing towards the end of the Light program. In fact, on the very last day, you did Housewife's Choice, and then in the evening you pretty much closed it down with
Music Through Midnight.
Music Through Midnight. Yeah.
Yeah, I closed the Light program. I had 2 programs on the last day of the Light program, and the next day Radio 1
Tony
launched.
Blackburn actually came onto that final show.
Yeah, he came onto
yes.
it, and very generously I let him promote the show that was taking over.
Absolutely.
I've always been very generous to Tony Blackburn. I'm not sure that it's been always totally reciprocated, but there you are. But yeah, I was very upset not to, when that famous picture that was taken on the steps of All Souls Church of the first lineup of Radio 1, because I'd been working for the Light program, I was hoping very much that I would get involved with that, and unfortunately I didn't, and I was upset, but it took 6 years before they finally gave me a daily show, and that happened in 1973, and ironically I missed the best 6 years because they had virtually a monopoly of pop radio, and it was only the year that I joined in June 73, and it was in the October that the first commercial stations, LBC and Capital, launched, and then they mushroomed all over the country.
Yeah. But then, of course, you moved into your golden period, really, didn't you? And you were so busy. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, you just sort of winding back a little before then. I think it was in 73. You were in Panto in Doncaster. You were driving down to London to do Terry Wogan's stand-in for Terry Wogan for his breakfast show on Radio 2. And you're going back to Doncaster to do the Panto. I mean, it's just quite extraordinary. And you repeated that much later on in your career when you joined Saga as well.
Yeah, I did. I've always worked very hard, but I don't think of it as work, really. I mean, I'll tell you a phrase of mine. People say sometimes, you get to my age and people are always going to say, when are you going to retire? And I always say that you don't retire from something you love. But I also say, if you find a job you love, you never do a day's work in your life. It's true. I've never worked a day in my life. I've loved every minute of it. And the other things that I've done, I worked in Speedway. I always loved Speedway racing. And so I did the announcing at Wembley and Reading, and then rode in a Speedway race at Wembley Stadium. I only put that in the book because it's such a dangerous thing to do. I've always loved football, and I was a director for a couple of years at Fulham Football Club, and then later for 18 years I was the man on the mic. So I did jobs that involved my hobbies, really.
I particularly loved your story about Bestie and Les Strong. We won't spoil it, but
I'll tell you the story.
It was a special training that they had.
Les Strong has always been a very good friend of mine, and still is, and he was the Fulham captain at the time. And Les was playing for Fulham along with Rodney Marsh and George Best, and that was the time when I was a director. And the chairman, Ernie Clay, said to me, "Now he was a North Country man who's from Yorkshire." He said,
"With a thick neck."
Eh?
With a thick neck.
Thick neck. And he said to me, "Now you're a director, you don't fraternise with the players anymore." So Les Strong said to me one day, he said, "You've become very stuck up." He said, "Since you've become a director, we don't see." I said, "The chairman." He said, "Oh, stuff him." He said, "We're your mates." So we had an away game at Crystal Palace. And so I had a drink with Les in the bar, which the chairman told me not to do. "Stuff him," said Les. So we stuffed him. I had a drink with Les in the bar, and I said, "As it happens, Les, you had a good game." So he said, "Well, it's funny you should say that, because last night Bestie and I were out on the piss." He said, "To be honest with you, we were still pissed when we kicked off at 12 o'clock at Crystal Palace." So I said, "Well, as a director of the club, my advice to you is this: if you can play like that on a Saturday afternoon, make that your regular training on a Friday night." Not very responsible, was it?
No. But anyway, they carried on doing it, so it didn't matter, did it? Really?
Well, they did, and it was. And do you know what? The football then was so entertaining
Yes.
because they had a duty to entertain, not just grind out results.
Yeah.
You know, they had a duty to entertain. Well, Noel, we've moved across the table. This is the water that's coming to you later.
I know.
So
It's
you're ready
so
for that?
inviting.
Don't jump in with all your clothes on.
Right.
Get your bathers on when we're finished.
I will. I'm looking forward to it. It does look so inviting.
Well, on a day like today, it's the only way to keep cool.
Absolutely.
This is summer, by the way. The day that we're here, this is the beginning and the end of summer.
I usually bring the good weather with me
You
when I
do.
come.
You do. Well, I think you usually come up here, don't you, in the summertime? And,
Yes.
you pick
We've
the
had a
time.
few hot days.
Pick the time well, yeah.
So we're kind of in the mid-70s now, which, you know, as I've said, you were so busy and you were doing the discos, and later on, of course, you were doing Top of the Pops as
Yes.
well, with contractual issues with Thames, but
Yes.
in the end you were doing Top of the Pops, and then of course you got the Seaside Specials on top
Yes.
of that. The 70s were a really, really busy time. And the other thing I love about the book is it brings in the atmosphere of the mid-70s at that time, which it would with somebody who was, let's face it, an iconic figure at that time. You know, you were like a pop star, you know, but you'd be opening supermarkets, people would be stopping you in the street asking for autographs, you know, and all the rest of it. So
Yes.
it was a good time for that as well.
It was a very heady time. Of course, nothing lasts forever. And after that, I moved to Radio 2, which didn't quite have the sort of glamorous image that Radio 1 had at that time. But I continued working and doing the job that I loved. And so the thing is that for me, radio has always been my first love. And I've sort of sidetracked into television. I got into television almost because it was so difficult at that time to get into radio. There wasn't much radio. And I did enjoy television, but radio was my first love. When I got my daily show on Radio 1, I mentioned this in the book, I'd only been doing it about 3 or 4 weeks when Thames offered me Wish You Were Here with Judith Chalmers. And of course that ran for about 25 years. And, you know, she went all around the world, had the best suntan in the business, and I had to turn it down because I had to be in a radio studio every day. And although I was sorry about that, I still preferred what I was doing, which was doing the radio show.
Because one of the things, as I said, the atmosphere of the mid-70s, and I know Radio 2 came in towards the latter end of it, but you could actually, you mentioned about several restaurants in the King's Road. One of them was called the Gasworks, I think,
Yes.
which sounded very interesting.
Yes, it was.
A chessboard with Kama
Kama
Sutra
Sutra, yes,
figures.
yes.
You know. But
Yes.
and I kind of remember that, although I was a child and I didn't get involved in that kind of stuff, obviously, or a teenager. But I do remember that you could drive your car up outside anywhere that you wanted to go, even Heathrow Airport, and just walk in.
Yeah.
And then you could go to these places. And so it really does give you the atmosphere of how London was in the swinging 70s, or not quite the swinging 70s.
Life was so much simpler then.
It was.
There was a restaurant we used to go to in the King's Road called the Casserole, and you could park right outside. And it was there one night for the first time. They had this wonderful music always in the background, and I heard Don McLean and American Pie.
Yes.
And my colleagues, who I think were some of the Fulham people, they just said, "Wow, what a fantastic record." That was the first time I heard it. So it's funny, isn't it, how, you know, records remind you of places.
Yes. And you had these friends that you used to go and stay in their various country houses. They must have been extremely rich.
Yes.
They had country houses apparently all over the home counties.
Yeah.
But they had a very discerning parrot, a very good judge of character.
Yeah, well, Dee Shenderi was the first DJ on Radio Luxembourg, and she married a man called Ken Shipman, who owned the Twickenham Film Studios. So I knew her from her DJ days, and became very friendly with the two of them. They had wonderful houses in the country where they always had a swimming pool, had a snooker table, and they had this wonderful parrot. It was an African parrot, and it was a talking parrot. And people would walk in there. Its name was Enki, and people would walk in the room, and Enki would go, "Hello, hello," and I walked in the room, and Enki went, "Fuck off."
I think we can get away with that. On David Hamilton's Hot Shots.
Everybody fell about with laughter. And why did he pick on me?
Maybe the first time, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard David Hamilton utter those words. But
well, I did it as a parrot.
Exactly. So I think we're going to obviously wind up in a few minutes, but I think I need to just temper the fact that the press have picked up and sensationalised some of the stories, and obviously that's going to help book sales, and that's what sells newspapers. But I think one of the things that comes across is obviously that you, beyond all that, were very much a caring family man, despite things that maybe went wrong at various times. Well, not wrong, but fate dictated. And there's a wonderful bit in it where Ken Dodd takes you out for fish and chips and explains to you how you play buttons, because you'd been playing buttons at the Bradford Alhambra. And he said, well, what you've got to remember, and I can't do Doddy, but what you've got to remember is that actually she really loves buttons more than she does the Prince. But at the same time, obviously the Prince has got more to offer, so buttons needs to play the part with a bit more pathos.
Yes.
And that word pathos sums up some of the things in the book, and some of the things that you say in the book about, you know, obviously leaving Sheila and, you know, so.
My first wife, yes.
Yeah.
I think every story has happiness and tears. I mean, coming back to Ken Dodd, you know, happiness and tears. Working with Ken Dodd and also Benny Cooper Benny Hill and Tommy Cooper was wonderful, because they were absolutely top of their game. And to have the chance to work with comedians like that on television was fantastic. They were all different. And Ken was known for being a little bit careful with his money. And he came to the matinee of the pantomime and he said, come on, I'll take you out for dinner. I thought, oh, that's nice. So we went to the fish and chip shop across the road, and he had it wasn't licensed, he had 2 lagers in his overcoat pocket, and he put them on the table. He said, cotton chips twice, love. And he gave me wonderful advice on how to play buttons. And a couple of days later, I was singing Smile to Cinderella on the kitchen table, you know, smile though your heart is aching. And as I walked off, a little boy on the front row shouted out, Cinders, marry buttons. So I got on the phone to Ken and I said, great. And he said, well done, son, you're on your way. Yeah. So he just gave me, you know, really good advice, and he was a wonderful buttons of how to work on the pathos, which is something I'd done all the happy chappy stuff, and I'd never done anything that was pathos before. But you're right, there is pathos in the book.
Yes, and I think when we're talking about the hostess, who you call Melanie in the book,
yes,
and your arrangement, but things went beyond the arrangement.
Well,
and you did actually start to feel for her.
Yeah, well, the press picked up on this and called her a prostitute. She wasn't really a prostitute. She was a nightclub hostess. I think there's a subtle difference.
Yeah.
But we had a thing called the arrangement, you know, where we had an arrangement.
Well, I called it a leg up for a bunk up, but.
Well, that's a bit crude, though, really.
Yeah, probably worse.
Not what
I'd
expect from you, a church warden as well. I wouldn't expect that.
Well, I've got to go and ring my bell in a minute.
I won't make any jokes about ringing bells, I think. But no, she had a pet shop in Surrey, which I opened for her. And yes, we did become good friends after the arrangement. But when Jenny Johnston came down from the Mail, she came here and she said to me, what were you thinking of when you wrote that? So I was just thinking, I was just thought that it was a quirky story and a quirky arrangement, and it reminded me a little bit of Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau and The Apartment. Do you remember that, when he had the apartment and he let him use his apartment and take his ladies there?
Yes. And
he paid for the apartment. So I don't know, I just thought, you know, it was a quirky story, really, and of course the press picked up on it.
Yes, indeed. Anyway, I think sort of in order to sort of finish things up, I think the one sentence that I think I'm right in quoting, you said, despite everything, and the book is a great read, obviously I suggest that you go out and get it. David Hamilton's Long and Winding Road.
The Long and Winding Road, can I tell you, is the road from here, where we are today, from the farm that I grew up on. I didn't come here for 50 years, and by a quirk of fate, meeting Junior Campbell again, I came back here. So it's the Long and Winding Road from here back to here, and all the places that I went to in between.
Absolutely. Tell me about that Long and Winding Road. I think it's taken my sump out.
What?
Tell me about that Long and Winding Road. I think it's taken my very bumpy.
It's very, when you get to here, the last bit is very, very bumpy.
Yeah, but it's worth the journey. It's absolutely beautiful here.
It is worth the journey. And I think we should have a very special thank you to our camera woman, who is Drina, aka Lady Hamilton, who's keeping a steady hand, I think, there, doing very, very well, and photographing us. She was asked by one of the newspaper people what she thought about my previous experiences before I met her. And she said, she's a very honest person, she said, I've got to say that before I met David, I wasn't exactly Snow White, but she said, I did get the best dwarf. And unfortunately, they couldn't use that in case it was offensive to dwarfs. Not to me, but to dwarfs. So they didn't use her quote. But I thought it was a brilliant quote, don't you?
Absolutely.
Brilliant.
It is. And I thought your quote was, and just to finish up, despite everything, you regret nothing.
No, I don't believe in regrets. Somebody wanted me to call it my life, my loves, and my regrets. But I don't have any regrets. And I tell you what I think, Noel. I think you do at the time what you think is the right time, right thing at the time. It might turn out later not to be, but at the time it seemed as though it was, And can I say, I mean, I think I'm quite self-critical at times in the book. It's not all, this was wonderful and that was wonderful. There are bits of, self-criticism in there.
Well, but it is lessons learned.
Lessons learned.
Yes.
Yes, and I hope I have learned a lot of lessons. I think I have. But really, I mean, I've had a wonderful life. To live to the age that I am now, when both my parents died in their 50s, is incredibly lucky, especially with a rock and roll lifestyle like mine.
Absolutely.
So I don't really know how I've done it, but and also, I've met some wonderful people. I've worked with some wonderful people, and as I said, I've never really done a day's work as such. So I don't want to come back. If I come back, it can't be this good again.
Well, let's hope that's a long time, and let's hope you can carry on not doing any day's work, but entertaining us all royally as you have done. Radio royalty, ladies and gentlemen, David Hamilton.
And I want to say a big thank you to Noel, because he set up this Hamilton's Hot Shots Facebook. I think it was 2017, was it?
It was the year before, actually, 2016. Yes.
So it's been running now for 8 years, and it's a labour of love, and it's been really wonderful. I shake your hand and
thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
It's always been a pleasure to do it.
And now you can have a swim.
I look forward to that. I'm going for my dip.
Don't frighten the cows.
I try not to.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you.